I want to focus your attention this morning on Psalm 146. Psalm 146, I'm going to read verses 1 through 5 of Psalm 146. We don't know who wrote this psalm. David wrote a lot of psalms, but he didn't write this one, and we're not sure who wrote this psalm. But whoever wrote this psalm says this: Praise the Lord, O my soul. I will praise the Lord as long as I live. I will sing praises to my God while I have my being. Put not your trust in princes, in a son of man, in whom there is no salvation. Because when his breath departs, he returns to the earth. On that very day, his plans perish. Blessed is he whose help is the God of Jacob, whose hope is in the Lord his God, who made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them. I have been preaching now for, I think the first sermon I preached, I was 22 years old. And I'm 48 now, so what is that, 26 years? I've been preaching for a long, long time. And I've never been in the habit of planning out months and months and months of sermons in advance. In fact, I don't understand how some of my friends are able to even do that. I've always planned on particular series, and then I've always mapped out how long I think it might take to preach that series. But I have friends who go away for a period of time every year and plan out their sermons for a year. I've never been able to do that. I've never had any desire to do that, to be honest with you. But even though my plans are somewhat minimal, God oftentimes, not oftentimes, once in a while, interrupts those plans. And so this morning, I was all set to start a new series entitled Unmasked, which we will start next week. Simply a series on the Ten Commandments. But as I was preparing for that series on Friday, I think it was Friday afternoon, and thinking through the escalated tensions in our country, God pressed me hard and inescapably to preach from Psalm 146 this morning. And that doesn't happen very often to me. And it's actually kind of scary when it's Friday afternoon, Friday evening, and you have your heart and your mind set on starting something in just 48 hours, and God sort of redirects your path so clearly that you can't say no, that you just know it's from God. That's what happened to me. So we will begin that series next week. But this morning, I am deeply and disturbingly convinced that we are in dire need of some biblical perspective here. I am watching people that I know, people that I love, friends, family members, acquaintances, people all over the place, radically losing perspective during this turbulent time. And as I have thought about it, I have thought just how direly we need some biblical perspective here. The first thing I want to say, and I want this to be abundantly clear, this is not a political sermon. You will never get a political sermon from me, ever. I can't stand that stuff from behind the pulpit. Can't stand it. In fact, in my opinion, I think pulpits that become politicized are the worst thing that can happen to the reputation of Christianity in the world. We come as Christians with a message from another world. We come as ambassadors from someone who has accomplished something that no matter what we do, we could never accomplish. And so this is not a political sermon. You will never get a political sermon from me, ever. This is, however, a theological sermon. And you will always get a theological sermon from me, always. I don't stand up here. I don't pretend to stand up here as someone who just has some strong opinions to share. I come as a man under authority, okay? It is not my job to get up here and give you some inspirational talk or motivational speech. It's not my job to stand up here and make you laugh or to entertain you or to tell you stories or whatever the case may be. My job is relatively simple. It's to simply say what God has said. That's it. I don't have another option. And so you'll always get a biblical sermon from me. You'll always get a theological sermon from me. But I want to say that at the outset so that you don't misinterpret what I'm about to say. There is nobody who doesn't need to hear Psalm 146. I don't care where you may be on the political spectrum. There is nobody that doesn't need to be reminded regularly of what the psalmist tells us here in Psalm 146. And this psalm tells us two things very plainly in the verses that I read, specifically verse 3 and verse 4. First, it warns us against putting our trust in or banking our hopes on anything or anyone in this world. I mean, that's plain. Verse 3, very clear. Put not your trust in princes, in a son of man, or some translations, in humans, in whom there is no salvation. Okay, makes very, very clear. It warns us against putting our trust in or banking our hopes on anything or anyone in this world. That's the first thing it does. The second thing this psalm does is it points us to the only one that we can trust in and bank our hopes on. So I want to kind of walk through this briefly because I think it's important for us to be reminded and reacquainted with the truth that is so plainly set before us here in this psalm. This psalmist, the one who wrote this psalm, gives us two reasons why it is foolish to put our trust in man or in anything that man produces. Two reasons that it's foolish. The first one he gives in verse 3, they can't save us. The second one he gives us in verse 4, they don't last. Two reasons why it is foolish to put our hopes in man or in anything man can produce. The first is that can't save us, verse 3. Second is they don't last, verse 4. I was thinking about this week. Christians should never expect too much from this world, ever. I mean, from Genesis chapter 3 onward, what we see is a fallen world made up of fallen people doing life with other fallen people. Okay, Christians should have the right perspective on these things in the sense that we should never expect too much from this world. Christians should never get too excited about politics, for instance, okay, ever. They shouldn't be overly relieved when things seem to be going well, and they shouldn't be overly concerned if things aren't going so well. They should be interested, they should vote, they should be informed, but they should never, ever get too excited. The Bible makes it plain that this world is not our home, that we are resident aliens, that we Christians live in this world with the next world in view, that this is not all that there is. Therefore, we should never get too excited about things here and now. We should take 38 Special's wise advice to hold on loosely. For those of you who don't know who 38 Special is, shame on you. So we should be interested. We should be informed, but we should never get too excited. Why? Well, the psalmist tells us, because nothing this world produces can save us. That's the first reason. Nothing. No government, no amount of military might, no president, no economic program, no laws, nothing. Okay, so stand for justice, vote your conscience, be a responsible citizen. But what I've seen from professing Christians on both sides of the aisle is not responsible citizenship. It is rank idolatry. And it's disturbing. It's a belief that the right president, the right government, the right policies, the right laws, et cetera, can save us. Idolatry. Idolatry is not, as you've heard me say before, idolatry is not people from far off lands bowing down to some wooden or stone statue somewhere, okay? Idolatry is simply placing ultimate hope in anything besides God. That's what idolatry is. And you can always identify someone's idol by their reaction when it's threatened in some way. Always. Oftentimes, as you've heard me say before, idols can be good gifts from God that we turn into ultimate objects of worship. So our spouse can become an idol to us. Our children can become an idol to us. Our financial security can become an idol to us. Good gifts from God that we turn into ultimate objects of worship. Things we depend on, things that we need in order to feel like we matter. Things that invest our lives with meaning and security and purpose and value and that sort of thing. Anything that we put in God's place becomes an idol, and oftentimes those are good gifts from God that we turn into ultimate things. And you can always identify someone's idol by their reaction when it's threatened in some way. Rage, terror, vitriol, an irrational, panic-stricken scramble to protect it. You can always see that. And this is not just a problem for non-Christians. Christians are also guilty of trusting in things smaller than God to make them feel safe, to give their lives stability and to give their lives meaning. We look to our achievements. We look to our reputation. We look to our relationships. We look to our strengths. We look to our place in society, our ambitions, and so on and so forth. We're all guilty of this at some level. So how about you? Who or what do you trust in to make you feel like all is well? What are you depending on to make you feel safe and to make you feel secure? And if that thing or that idea or that person is anything other than Jesus, it's become your idol. We can all identify them. The Protestant reformer John Calvin, 500 years ago, said that the human heart is an idol-making factory. That we take the good things that God gives us and we turn them into ultimate objects of worship. We turn them into things that we depend on that are smaller than God to invest our lives with meaning and value and purpose and security and safety and all that stuff. All of us stand on an endless catalog of God replacements that end up sinking beneath us because, as the psalmist says, they are incapable of providing the solid rock of salvation that we crave in our deepest parts. The first commandment, which we will look at beginning next week, well, not next week. Next week is an introduction to the series. The first commandment will actually be the week after that, okay? But the first commandment, what is it? Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Jonah, at the end of Jonah says, those who cling to worthless idols forfeit the grace that could be theirs. The second we experience a certain amount of pain because our idols are being threatened, it's oftentimes God prying open our hands to take away those things that we're holding on to more dearly than Him. I can't tell you how many times over the course of my life I've experienced the pain of withdrawals because God, in His love, in His mercy, in His grace, is taking something away from me that I have come to depend on more than Him. And so God will oftentimes pry open our hands to take those things away from us that we are clinging to more desperately than Him because false gods rob us of true freedom. That's why. The second reason the psalmist warns us not to put our trust in anything or anyone in this world is because they don't last. The first reason is because they can't save us. They can't rescue us. They can't be for us what only God has promised to be for us. But the second reason is because they don't last. History is the greatest proof that people come and people go. Things come and things go. Ideologies come and ideologies go. World leaders come and world leaders go. Empires rise and empires fall. I mean, that's really all history is a retelling of those things over and over and over again. In 1996, my grandparents were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal of Honor, which is the highest award that our country can give to a private citizen. At the time that my grandparents were awarded that, there were only, I think, 101 other recipients. The first one being George Washington, okay? So they were in good company, exclusive company. And we, as a family, were all invited to this amazing ceremony in the Capitol Rotunda. And it was just, I mean, it was a memory for the ages. The entire House and Senate were there, world leaders, religious leaders. I mean, the Capitol Rotunda was packed with people who were there to honor my grandparents. And Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, got up, along with Senate Majority Leader at the time, Bob Dole, to talk about how this decision was made to give this honor to my grandparents. And when my granddad was invited to come up and speak and address the people that were there, everybody gave him a standing ovation. It seemed to last for 5 minutes. I remember standing there clapping for him, tears streaming down my face, so incredibly proud and grateful to God that he gave me the family that he gave me. And then my granddad sat us down, and after some initial comments about how grateful he and my grandmother were and how honored they were to be getting this high honor and this award, he said to everybody that was there, the President of the United States, who was Bill Clinton at the time, was not there, but Al Gore was there. I mean, you're talking some of the most powerful people in this country sitting in that room. And if you've ever been to the Capitol Rotunda, you know that on the peripheral of the rotunda are busts of world leaders that have lived throughout, or our country's leaders who have lived, you know, from the time that our country was founded. And my granddad stood up, and I'll never forget this. He said, all of the busts in this room, of all of the men in this room, all of whom represented different political ideologies in a variety of different ways, they all have one thing in common. And he gave this pregnant pause as we waited for his answer. He said, "They're all dead." I mean, it was just so characteristically simple from him and profound. And it was his way of saying, we're really not that important. Death is the great equalizer. It's what the psalmist says right here. Why should we not put ultimate hope in man or in the things of this world? He tells us they don't last. They die. And from dust they came, and to dust they will return. End of story. And we oftentimes act, react, live, respond as if one wrong move will send our entire existence and the human race into oblivion, as if God is taking a nap. Elsewhere, the psalmist tells us the God of Israel never slumbers and never sleeps. He's never taking a break. He's never out to lunch. Our deepest hope, our strongest security cannot come from anything or anyone in this world. Isaiah puts it like this in Isaiah 40. All flesh is grass, and all its beauty is like the flower of the field. The grass withers and the flower fades, when the breath of the Lord blows on it. Surely the people are grass. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God abides forever. I have a Latin abbreviation tattooed on my arm right here, which stands for the word of the Lord abides forever. A reminder that things come, things go. Empires rise, empires fall. God, his truth, his word, his purposes, his plans are the only thing that last forever. Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 2 says this to the Corinthians, "My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on human wisdom, but on God's power." I've seen a lot of resting on human wisdom and not so much on God's power. As uncomfortable as instability may be, it is an opportunity to remember who God is and the promises that God has made. It really is. You know when the church historically, the people of God, have thrived the most? When their influence has spread the farthest? When they have been massively persecuted? All the way back to the Roman Empire. In fact, when Jesus commissioned, before he ascended back to the Father, and he commissioned his disciples to go into all the world, they were scared. And so they gathered in this upper room in Jerusalem, hiding out, hunkering down. And they weren't going where Jesus told them to go. Well, what's very interesting in the book of Acts is it says, at that time, God sent a persecution to the people of God, and it caused them to scatter. Where? To all of the places he told them to go. You look throughout history, not just biblical history, but church history. You look throughout history, the church has always thrived the most, has always been the healthiest. Not when it's had the most power. That's when it's been the most corrupt, when it's had the most power. When it has had the least power, it is when it has been most powerful. And that shouldn't surprise us, because Paul tells us in Corinthians that it is in and through our weakness that God showcases his strength. It's not our strength that this world needs to see. It's God's strength that this world needs to see. And if we're always striving after might and muscle and strength, they won't see God's strength. They'll only see ours, which is pathetic in comparison. So as uncomfortable as instability may be, it's always an opportunity to remember who God is and the promises that God has made. The first thing to remember is maybe the most basic, and it's simply this: God is in control. Okay, knowing that this world, even in all of its messed upness, is under the caring power of God helps us keep things in perspective during times of unrest. Charles Spurgeon put it this way: the sovereignty of God is a soft pillow on which the weary lay their heads. As basic as it may sound, it's important to remember that God is in charge. Your life, along with the events in this world, are under the compassionate direction of an all-in-control God. The Bible is unmistakable about that. There is not some cosmic tug-of-war battle going on between God and the devil, okay, or between good and evil. And the Bible makes it very, very clear. And we see this in Job, when in that mysterious passage where the devil approaches God and says, "You've put a hedge of protection around Job. That's why he worships you. Look at all the stuff you've given him." And God says, "Okay, I want to prove that Job worships me for me and not for what I give him. So I'll give you permission to afflict him. But you can go this far and no further. James tells us that the devil is a roaring lion, seeking to destroy, but he is a roaring lion held on a tight leash by God. In that sense, the devil himself works for God. Okay? And so it's important to remember that God is in control. When I was a child, my mom would put me to bed every night, and oftentimes she would sing, "He's got the whole world in his hands." And it was her way of reassuring me right before I went to sleep that everything is under God's merciful rule and dominion. Everything. It's the same thing Paul says in Romans 8. God works all things, not some things, all things out for the good, for our good and his glory. Omnipotence is a big theological word that simply conveys the fact that God is all-powerful. Omnipresence is a big theological word that conveys the idea that God is everywhere at the same time. Omnipotent is the idea that God is all-powerful. And I think it was Charles Spurgeon who said, omnipotence has servants everywhere. Everything works toward God's purposed end. Everything. So what if, let's just pose this question, okay? What if, regardless of what end of the political spectrum you find yourselves on, all of your worst fears come true? So what? So what? What if the worst things imaginable, where, soldiers come barging through church doors and say, unless you stop worshiping God, we're going to kill you. And then they kill us all. To live as Christ, to die as gain. Who cares? What are we so worried about? God is in control, and he's never not been in control. Ever. Ever. The only thing we need to know is that God promised that he will never leave us or forsake us. And you and I don't need any more security than that. Period. And while that does not mean that he will rescue us from every trouble in this world, it does mean that he will be with us through every trouble in this world. And I guess my question for all of us this morning is that enough for you? Is that enough for me? Is God enough? Is his promise to be with us no matter what enough? Well, if it is, then you can face all of your fears with confidence and, dare I say, joy, because you know that God is in control. The hope of the Christian faith, and let me make this very clear, is not that we will in this life be free from calamity. Rather, it is that God promises to be with us in calamity. That's the hope. And the center of our faith is Jesus, Emmanuel, which means literally God with us, the one who entered into our fallenness and our fear and saved us. In other words, God is not some distant sovereign. He doesn't rule from afar. His reign over our lives and in this world is not just all powerful, it is also all personal. The same God who spoke the world into existence from far away came near in the person of Jesus. Which is why the psalmist says, "Blessed is he whose help is the God of Jacob, whose hope is in the Lord his God." Why? Because nothing we do is capable of solving our greatest problem. Nothing. In fact, it is everything we have done that has caused our greatest problems. okay? As Pogo said, we have met the enemy and it is us. The human race does not have a track record of fixing things. We have a track record of breaking things. Starts in Genesis chapter 3 and goes on to our present day. And to those who might think that we just need things around us to change, that all we need is a new environment, a better structure, listen to what Martin Lloyd-Jones had to say to that. The terrible fallacy of the last 100 years has been to think that all man's troubles are due to his environment, and that to change the man, you have nothing to do but change what's going on around him. That is a tragic fallacy. It overlooks the fact that it was in paradise that man fell. Couldn't have been a better situation. Perfect paradise. It was in that perfect setting that we rebelled, that we chose to believe in ourselves more than to believe in God. So if our greatest need was economic, God would have sent an economist. If our greatest need was entertainment, he would have sent an entertainer. If our greatest need was political stability, he would have sent a politician. If it was health, he would have sent a doctor. But because our greatest need was sin and death, he sent a Savior. That's who we bank on. That's who we trust in, ultimately. Malcolm Muggeridge was a British journalist in the 20th century, mid-late 20th century, who became a Christian later in life. He was very well known in his day, was editor of a famous magazine called Punch magazine in Great Britain. And his unique journalistic perspective on 20th century world history is both very true and very poetic. He wrote what I'm about to read you in the 1970s, late 1970s, just to give you some perspective on why he says some of the things he says and makes reference to some of the things that he makes reference to. But he says this: we look back on history and what do we see? Empires rising and falling, revolutions and counter-revolutions, wealth accumulated and wealth dispersed. Shakespeare has written of the rise and fall of great ones that ebb and flow with the moon. I look back upon my own British countrymen, once upon a time dominating a quarter of the world, most of them convinced in the words of what is still a popular song, that the God who made them mighty shall make them mightier yet. I've heard a crazed, cracked Austrian, Hitler, announce to the world the establishment of a Reich that would last 1,000 years. I've seen an Italian clown, Mussolini, say that he was going to stop and restart the calendar with his own ascension to power. I've heard a murderous Georgian brigand in the Kremlin, Stalin, acclaimed by the intellectual elite of the world as being wiser than Solomon, more humane than Marcus Aurelius. I have seen America wealthier and in terms of military weaponry, more powerful than the rest of the world put together, so that had the American people so desired, they could have outdone a Caesar or an Alexander in the range and scale of their conquests. All in one lifetime, all gone with the wind. England, now a part of a tiny island off the coast of Europe, threatened with dismemberment and even bankruptcy. Hitler and Mussolini dead, remembered only in infamy. Stalin, a forbidden name in the regime he helped found and dominate for some 3 decades. America haunted by fears of running out of those precious fluids that keeps their motorways roaring and the smog settling, with troubled memories of a disastrous campaign in Vietnam and the victories of the media as they charged the windmills of Watergate. All in one lifetime, all gone. Gone with the wind. Behind the debris of these solemn supermen and self-styled imperial diplomatists, there stands the gigantic figure of one, because of whom, by whom, in whom, and through whom alone mankind may still have peace, the person of Jesus Christ. My hope, my prayer has been, as I've thought about us this week, you specifically. I'm your pastor. I care about a lot of people, but I care about you guys the most. It's like I love your kids, but I love mine more. You are who God has called me to. You. Not just this church in general, you. I care about your heart, your mind, your understanding of yourself, your understanding of God. I care that God rescues you, that he sets you free, that he saves you. It matters to me. It's why I'm here. There are a lot of easier ways to make a living, okay, than pastoring a church. I can promise you that. If you know of any, let me know. I'm just kidding. And as I was thinking about you in particular, and we don't talk politics. We don't. So I don't know where all of you guys stand on things. And honestly, I don't really care. I really don't. What I do care about is that we live in this world with a hope that transcends this world. That we are able to make our way through the wilderness of this life with hope and joy and peace because we know God and because we know that God knows us. And that he, by sending Jesus to us, has already demonstrated that his love for us is unquestionable. It's unconditional. That he has done and will continue to do everything necessary to get us to the finish line. Everything. That the one who began a good work in us will see it through to completion. That's our hope. That is what I want. When I was driving here this morning, I was thinking about what is it that I really want the sanctuary to be known for? You know, these are crazy times. Crazy times. I mean, there's, when we shut down back in March, I guess, we were only 6 months old as a church. But we were moving along at a nice clip, I mean, the future was bright. And then Corona, okay? And then everything started looking relatively bleak, and everyone got a little bit concerned, understandably, and not knowing what the future was going to hold and what this meant. And I was personally concerned about this church. I didn't know what was going to happen. I really didn't. And about maybe a quarter of our church is gathering in person on Sunday mornings. And to be honest, that can sometimes be scary, And so I was driving here thinking, what is it that I want for this church? And what is it that I want people to know about this church? And what do I want this church to be known for more than anything? I just want it to be a place where the people here really believe in God. Where when people hear about the sanctuary, they know that's you can go there and meet God. Paul tells us that when people come into our worship services, the Apostle Paul, that when people come into our worship services, our adoration of God should be so thick that people leave here going, God was surely in that place. God was there. I didn't understand everything the preacher said. I didn't even like all the music. But God was there. We focus on so many small things. If God is here, it's what matters. And I want you to know God, and I want you to know that God knows you, and I want you to feel safe, and I want you to feel secure, and I want you, like Sting says, a gentleman will walk but never run, in his song, A Gentleman in New York, I think. Is that right? An Englishman in New York? I want us to be able to walk and never run because we have peace. We know who we are. More importantly, we know whose we are. And that gives our life a stability and a security regardless of what's going on around us. And in that way, we will be salt and light, a lighthouse to a world gone mad. People go, what's the matter with you? Why aren't you freaking out? Don't you see what's going on? What are you going to say? If you're freaking out just like everybody else, You look just like everybody else. Who would ask you where you have hope? But when everybody's freaking out, when everything's going to hell in a handbasket, and you're walking and not running with joy and security and contentment, people are like, what's the matter with you, man? I mean, don't you see? What an amazing opportunity it is for you to go, I'm not worried about this. Well, what do you mean you're not worried? How can you not be worried? Why would I be worried? I know whose world this is, and I know who's in charge, and I know that he's good, and that while I might not be able to explain all that I see, I know the God behind it. The one illustration that I have used before to illustrate this has to do with my dad, who was, in my humble opinion, the greatest man who ever lived. He was one of my best friends and my chief encouragers. One of my greatest regrets in life is that my wife, Stacy, never met my dad. He was the greatest. Bruce knew my dad. A few of you knew my dad. Amazing. Just high character, high integrity. And I used to say this, that if someone told me that my dad was coming out of some woman's apartment at midnight, I might not be able to tell you what he was doing, but I could certainly tell you what he wasn't doing because I knew my dad. Well, the same is true with God. Faith trusts God even when it cannot trace him. We may not be able to explain what God is doing, but we can certainly say what he's not doing. He's not being not good. He's not being not loving. He's not being unjust. God doesn't do something because it is just. Something is just because God does it. Very different. Very, very different. There's not some external standard of justice that God, because he's a good God, has to conform to. God doesn't do something because it's just and good and loving. Something is just and good and loving because God does it. So we have the hope that we need, the security that we need, because the God that we need has done something about our greatest problem. And that gives us an assurance that all is well. Let's pray together.